Consider this your warning. Get a coffee or tea since we are entering an absurd and frustrating scenario, and realize this is a long story. While some of the material has previously been posted on my channel, I will also add the most recent updates you would not want to miss. If you know the history, check the timestamps in the description to move ahead. My name is Jason, and I have spent most of my life negotiating the aftermath of a problematic family dynamic. Early 30s. Danny, my younger brother, is 29. Starting with his first at 22 and the youngest arriving just a few months ago, he already is a father to 4 children. I get along with his wife Rachel, not with him. Rachel represents the height of a self-centered drama queen. My parents love Rachel even though they know exactly what kind of person she is. She feeds on chaos, plays the victim if things don't go her way, and has an amazing capacity to shed crocodile tears on cue to gain sympathy. She is rather beautiful, to be honest, but her attitude is so poisonous that even her appearance would not appeal to me. Rachel leaves my brother to handle all the financial obligations. She declines to work even with a college degree. To add to it, they share a small 3-bedroom house built in the 1960s with my parents. Respect of privacy? Ignored it. Danny was the golden child growing up. He was only 3 years my junior, yet he was always given the lion's share of our parents' resources and attention. I was penalized if I ventured to object to the obvious bias, not just disregarded. As we grew older, Danny reveled in the unearned glory of being the perfect son, while I battled to create a place for myself. Things grew more intense. Danny would make fun of my bad luck, flirt with my first girlfriend until she dumped me, and even occasionally act physically aggressive. What was the answer from my parents? Suck it up, Jason. The only time I got equal treatment was when they needed to keep up appearances at family gatherings. When I turned 18, my parents basically welcomed my leaving. I packed and left not even quite done with high school. Though it was difficult, couch surfing was immensely better than living under their roof. Fast forward to 2020, when the epidemic flipped everyone's life upside down. I lost my job, and my fellow struggling roommate moved back in with his family. I had to sell most of my stuff since I couldn't renew the lease on our condo without income. I had been living above my means for years, and now I had nothing to fall back on. Without any other choices, I bought a $1,000 camper and set it on my truck. Though it was not perfect, it was a temporary fix. Until I got back on my feet, I intended to park it at my parents' place. But when I asked, they flatly turned away. Rachel found my situation funny, and Danny joined her in teasing me. They said their house was too full, and unless I paid them an outrageous fee, equivalent to renting an apartment, they wouldn't let me stay. Calling me a homeless bum, they advised I should simply vanish. Fearful out of my mind that someone could break in during the night, I ended up parking my camper in a store parking lot. For months, I lived the nomadic camper life, hopping from one site to another. I handled everything from inquisitive homeowners accusing me of breaking their bogus HOA regulations to covert visits to charge the batteries in my camper using arbitrary outside plugs. Though I had a terrible life, I made it work. Eventually, I found work in a nearby city. When the owner of the company saw I was living in my camper and let me park it at the rear of the warehouse, he started to pity me. Working any shift I could get, I earned extra pay and gradually rebuilt my finances. By mid-2022, I had been elevated to a supervisory post. Having a steady income, I started looking for a place of my own and finally bought a little 3-bedroom house close to my employment. Though not elegant, it was mine. When I moved in, I made a happy update on social media, at last having a place to call home. That was my first error. Danny, Rachel, and my parents showed up at my door unannounced a few weeks later. Not even had I sent them my address. Though my theory is they stalked me at work and followed me home, they bargained in like they owned the house, looking around and making themselves comfortable. How they located me is still unknown. Rachel wore a haughtiness that fired off alarms right away. Danny, always the opportunist, suggested we chat alone when my parents started remarking on how spacious the house was and how too big for someone like me. Danny dropped the bombshell as soon as we were alone. Rachel was pregnant once more. Thus, I requested me to let him and his family move into my house since it was closer to his place of work. He said I could live in my camper in the rear while they occupied the main house. I was stunned. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. Danny stood there, arms crossed, as though his demands were entirely reasonable. He not only neglected to offer me rent, but also had the audacity to tell me there would be rules, curfews, restrictions on when I could enter the house, and other absurd conditions. I couldn't believe the blatant entitlement pouring out of his mouth. He was assuring me this was for the family, and I would eventually appreciate him for doing the right thing. I finally stopped his rambling with a hard no, not a quiet no. It was loud enough to knock the house's walls. Rachel and even their children had neatly stepped out onto the porch to provide us privacy for this little ambush. Danny staggered backward for a moment, obviously not anticipating any opposition. "This is my house," I said, "and there's no way in hell I'm giving it to you." The room went quiet, but the awkwardness was fleeting. That was the last straw. Danny came forward, his face inches from mine, growled, "You don't deserve this house," then said he was a real family man and needed it more than I did because of his kids. "I bought this house," I said. Danny wasn't done. "I worked my ass off to buy it, and it's not my fault you keep having kids you can't afford." From guilt-tripping me over his unborn child to asserting our parents had already approved this idea. He experimented with every manipulative technique in the book. He understood I was not moving. When things didn't go his way, he raced to Mommy and Daddy. The porch door flung open, and my parents hurried in like backup dancers to a poor Broadway production. "Why would you not do this for your brother?" my mom grumbled, tears already starting to flow. Rachel, of course, was not far behind. My dad intervened, calling me selfish and unappreciative of all they had supposedly done for me over the years. She stamped back in with a glare that might tear paint off the walls. "I'm expecting," she gasped, using dramatic effect by grabbing her stomach. "You cannot do this to me." I laughed, a big, unreserved chuckle. "What specifically have I done to you, Rachel?" I inquired. "You are the one who believed you could stroll in here and grab my house as if it were some prize you were due. I owe you nothing." That's when things went bad. Rachel came at me, giving me a hard enough slap to sting. Danny grabbed her and yanked her back as she shouted, "Let me go!" before she could get another strike. "I will scratch his eyes out." I grabbed my phone, coolly held it up, and struck record. My parents tried to defuse, but only because they knew I wasn't bluffing. "Touch me again," I cautioned, "and I'll make sure this gets to the police." With her most patronizing voice, my mother said, "You just need time to consider this, Jason. You will come to your senses." "I don't need time," I said. "Leave my house, every one of you." Now, naturally, they did not leave immediately. Rachel first bolted, crying loudly enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. Danny trailed along, murmuring under his breath about how I would regret this. Looking back over her shoulder with a last desperate plea, "Please, just do it for your brother." My mother was the last to leave. I slammed the door behind them, locked it, and leaned against it for a while. Though my heart was pounding, I felt pride. I had stood up to them without thinking twice, for the first time in years. But I knew this was not finished. Not quite by chance. The narrative burned across our extended family like wildfire over the next several days. Danny, Rachel, and my parents sought to change the story, such that I would be the self-serving villain who turned away from helping his struggling brother. They undervalued me, though. I had already shared my side of the story on social media with a video clip of Rachel's tantrum. The reaction was mostly to my advantage. Although most of the family had always suspected favoritism, they were unaware of just how bad it was. Now, with actual data, they couldn't refute the truth. Of course, there were still holdouts, Danny's flying monkeys, as I dubbed them. These were the relatives that gave him unquestioning support, regardless of circumstances. One even came to criticize me, declaring, "A real guy puts his family first. You ought to be embarrassed of yourself." I didn't even bother to debate. 1 week later, they returned. I just hung up and blocked the number. This time, it was an invasion, not a visit at all. I heard banging on the door before I ever saw them peeking through. Standing there were my parents, Danny and Rachel, their arms braced with boxes. Danny had the cheekiness to smile and wave like this, as if it were some sort of friendly housewarming. There was even a moving truck parked in my driveway. "We are moving in." "Like hell you are," he exclaimed. I snarled, hardly opening the door. Before they could try to shove their way in, I grabbed my phone and contacted the cops. Realizing what was happening, Rachel began yelling about how I was ruining her life and pounded on the door. Minutes later, the police showed up. By then, Danny and Rachel had barricaded themselves within my house, hammering out my locks and substituting new ones. One important error they made, though, was leaving the old lock and drill in plain sight on the porch. When the cops asked for evidence I owned the house, I presented my ID and mortgage records. Ever the con artist, Danny produced a fictitious rental agreement claiming I had agreed to allow them to move in. It was ridiculous. The officials were not buying the document since the signature on it appeared unlike mine. The cops had more than enough evidence when I showed them the damaged lock and the drill to order them out. The scene that ensued combined comedy with anarchy. Rachel sobbed and tore apart the fictitious rental agreement in dramatic slow motion, acting out a rage worthy of an Oscar. "It's not too late, Jason," my mother continued often. Rachel tried one last guilt trip, gathering her children into a group hug and wailing, "Look at what you're doing to your nieces and nephews." Danny, for his part, just stood there looking like a scolded child, his arms full of boxes he now had to put back into the moving truck loaded up. I remained calm. "Take your pity party elsewhere," I advised. The police were clearly relieved when they left at last. One even murmured, "I don't get paid enough for this." But I knew this wasn't the end as I watched the moving truck go. For now, though, I had won. My family had always been stubborn, and I knew they would have returned with another plan. Still, my residence, I felt as though I had the upper hand for the first time in years. I assumed I would get a little break following the moving truck fiasco. Once more, my house was mine. For the first time in months, I could breathe free from the weight of my family's entitlement crushing down on me. Though deep down I knew it was not over, I knew they had at last received the loud and plain message. People like Danny and Rachel do not give up. They gather and return with a fresh strategy. I concentrated on getting settled into my place in the interim. I had been barely squeaking by living out of a trailer for years. I now had walls, a roof, and personal space to call upon. It was weird. I had purchased a modest, 3-bedroom manufactured house. Not particularly elegant, but more than plenty for me. I even positioned the camper in the backyard, almost as a trophy of the battle I had gone through. It served as a reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. I began to personalize the house. Although every space had unique characteristics, organizing them seemed somehow healing. On weekends, I painted rooms, put furniture together, and started a small garden outside. The life seemed steady. I felt permanency for the first time in a long time. The social media backlash, of course, does not stay long. Danny and Rachel embraced social media and spun their own version of events. They said I was the merciless brother who had turned his back on family in their hour of need. Ever the playwright, Rachel presented herself as a saintly mother of 4, mercilessly denied a safe home for her children. The saddest part was that some folks really thought them true. One really frustrating comment I received was, "A real man takes care of his family no matter what." I started receiving messages from far-off relatives and even total strangers criticizing me for selfishness. "Shame on you," I did not reply. For what reason was this important? Anyone who knew the whole truth was definitely on my side. I wrote one carefully chosen post to clear the record. I only described the circumstances broadly. I did not name people or go to their level. "Judging when you lack the whole picture is easy," I said. But nobody has the right to insist on something not theirs. The post went viral in our family. I worked hard for my house and won't be sorry for defending what I have achieved. Relatives who had always sensed the partiality but had not seen it so openly before began to show support. It was about a lifetime of treatment, like I was less than, not only about the house. People were defending me for the first time, and it felt great. I was feeling secure enough to do a little get-together by Christmas. I asked a handful of supportive relatives, an aunt, several cousins, even an uncle I hadn't seen in years. There was wonderful food, music, and laughter throughout a pleasant affair. I felt as though I belonged to a family that valued me for the first time. Then they showed up, Danny, Rachel, and my dad. They neither knocked nor made an advance call. They merely danced as though they belonged there. As I was serving pie, the door flung wide, and there they were, all grins, clutching inexpensive, hurriedly wrapped gifts. The room fell still. "What are you doing here?" With a tone full of false sweetness, my mother answered, "We just wanted to join the family celebration," barely keeping her voice steady. "It's Christmas, after all." Before I could say anything, my uncle, my mom's own brother, stood up and unleashed loose. "You deserve not to be here," he shot. "Not after all you have put Jason through." The room's tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. At last, my grandparents, who had been silently drinking eggnog, spoke up. With a shaky voice, my grandmother added, "We're ashamed of you. You always preferred Danny, but this is really beyond the pale. Far too soon if you wish to atone. Jason deserves better." The meltdown. Rachel started crying naturally. She wailed about how unfair it was that I had a house while she was crammed into my parents' house with her 4 children and slumped into a chair. "I'm a mother here, Dot." She bent down to cry. "I deserve a house where my kids can flourish. I let go without thinking twice. You do not deserve anything you have not earned," I responded, my voice firm. "Rachel, you have never worked a day in your life. You sat on your butt, fiddling Danny's money, while my mother raised your children. The crowd erupted if you wanted a house. Go get a job and buy one." Rachel's children began to weep. Danny reddened with shame. My mother tried to cool everyone down. The harm was done, though. Finally seeing the reality were my family, the ones who had always encouraged Danny and Rachel. They went finally, but not without a last appeal from my mother. Whispering as she left, "Please, Jason," she said, "you can still do this for Danny." I ignored answering. I simply closed the door and locked it behind them. The party gradually returned to life after they left. We switched the music back on, loaded another round of eggnog, and tried to save the evening. True family members made sure I understood they were proud of me for standing my ground. As I sat there surrounded by individuals who really cared about me, I came to see something crucial. I didn't need my parents' approval. I had no need of Danny's regard. I sensed freedom for the first time. Things slowed considerably in the next few weeks. Rachel stopped posting her passive-aggressive digs on social media. My parents and Danny stopped phoning, and at last I felt I could fit into my new life. But I knew better than to let my defenses slack. People who enjoy them regroup rather than giving up. I therefore waited. For a few weeks following Christmas, life resumed something like usual. The drama that had marked my year seemed to have burned out on me. Danny, Rachel, and my folks had stopped talking. No more unplanned trips, no more strange notes, no more social media ruckus. I plunged myself into work, and the house, like a storm, had passed, leaving a delicate, tranquil calm. Once the holidays were over, I finally had time to concentrate on the little things, fixing a leaky faucet, planning my small backyard garden, and even working on a do-it-yourself shelf project that took far more time than it ought to have. Having a place wholly mine where I could do as I wished, free from intervention from others, felt fantastic. Deep down, though, I knew it wasn't done. Rachel was not the type of person to own failure, and Danny, spine-like as he was, would not fight her for long. Sure enough, she moved about a month later, albeit this time it was not via my front door. It began with a fresh surge of social media posts. Rachel did not specifically name me, but everyone who had been following the family narrative could identify the person she was referring to. "It's so tragic when people choose money over family," she said. "It would have been ridiculous if it weren't so frustrating. Some of us are striving to provide our children with a better life, while others only think of themselves." Rachel, who had never worked a day in her life, tried to guilt me, the man who had lived in a tent for 2 years, about not helping the family. I ignored the postings, as tempting as it was to shoot back. I knew better than to feed the beast. But Rachel was not done. A few days later, she escalated. One particularly bold message read, "You have a whole house to yourself while a struggling family is packed into one room." My phone started blowing with texts from unknown numbers, people I didn't recognize, all parroting the same lines about how I should step up and help Danny and Rachel. One particularly bold message read, "In what way can you live with yourself?" I blocked the figure. Danny himself soon started to get in touch. Danny came at me with a milder approach than Rachel, who flourished on confrontation. His tone was especially somber when he phoned one evening when I was seeing a movie. "Hey man," he said cautiously, "I just wanted to talk." I did not hang up, although I probably ought to have. Rather, I let him go on about how difficult life was at my parents' house. "The children are always fighting," he remarked. "Rachel is stressed. Mom is under strain. It's messy." He stopped to let me say something. "Look," he said, "I know things got out of hand before, but family is what we are, and right now, family supports one another." I sighed. Immediately, I knew where this was leading. "Danny, what do you wish for?" "Just let us move in," he urged, the words coming out if he was frightened to give me time to resist. "This time we will pay rent, I'll promise. It will just be temporary." "No," I responded firmly. "Not happening." Danny began to argue, but I cut him off. "Danny, you broke into my house. You swapped out my locks. After that, do you really believe I will let you live here?" Silence on the other side of the line was followed by a faint, "We didn't mean for it to go that far." "But it did," I responded, "and I'm not going to overlook that. Look for still another solution, Danny. My house isn't it." He left without saying goodbye. A week later, I got home from work to find my parents seated on my porch. Older, somehow, than they had at Christmas. They looked exhausted. My mom had that begging look I would have come to hate, while my dad was stone-faced as usual. "Can we talk?" she questioned, as I got to the door. I crossed my arms. "Regarding what?" "Danny," she said. "And the children, of course." My mother started a usual spiel about family, duty, and how difficult things were for Danny and Rachel, constantly emphasizing Danny. Though I spotted him nodding every now and again, my dad remained quiet. "We're not asking you to let them live here permanently," my mom remarked. I interrupted her off, saying, "Just until they can get on their feet." "No," I responded. "I know this from past experience. It's not happening." "Jason, please," she murmured with a shaky voice. "They are your family. And where were they when I was living out of a camper?" I shot back. "Where were you?" That caused her to shut down. For a minute, however. "You're better than this," she remarked gently at last. I shook my head, opening the door. "You're not the kind of person who turns their back on family. I'm not the kind of person that gets walked all around either. Now, if you will pardon me, I have things to do." After that, things got rapidly out of control. That day, my parents departed without more conflict, but it was obvious they were not giving up. A few days later, I returned home to discover a letter in my mailbox. A long, ragged appeal from Rachel, asking me to give it some thought. She also supplied drawings of her children, as though it would persuade me differently. Not so much. The visit broke me at last. From my folks. Not from Danny or Rachel, once more here. They included the children this time. Arriving unannounced, the children in tow looked as horrible as possible. It was manipulation at its best, and I was not having it. "You think this is going to change my mind?" Glaring at my parents as the children ran across my yard, I questioned. "They're just kids," my mother answered with a faltering voice. "They understand nothing." "Then tell them," I said, snapping. "Tell them the truth. Tell them about the attempt at house theft by their parents. Tell them, when I was homeless, their parents laughed at me. Tell them their parents are the reason they find themselves caught at your place rather than here." Mom looked like I had slapped her. Though my dad said nothing, his jaw clearly showed strain. I said, a low but forceful, "Go home. Take the children and head home, and stay away." The tranquility following the tempest ended thereafter as well. The books came to a standstill. Even the postings on social media halted. It felt as though they had at last understood the message, for the first time in many months. Though it felt more like a loss, I had won. The truth was that I wanted no conflict with my family. Cutting them out of my life did not appeal to me. To maintain harmony, nevertheless, I was not ready to give up my personal stability and contentment. I felt liberated, first of all. My house was mine. Nobody could have taken that away from me. For some months, nothing was happening. Quite silent. Danny and Rachel were vanished from my life, or so it seemed, and my parents had discontinued guilt trips. Like the stillness before a storm, the quiet was almost sinister. Still, I avoided letting myself linger on it. Rather, I concentrated on getting more into my house and deciding what I wanted to do going forward. Work was flowing, and I even began to consider dating once more. Originally a reminder of the difficult times I had endured, my camper was still parked out back now, acting as a guest space for the odd friend that dropped over my house. Life was beginning to seem ordinary, tranquilly, consistent. Rachel then appeared. Friday night, and I had just returned from work, the second I saw her when getting out of my pickup. Rachel had that trademark arrogant expression on her face as she stood on the pavement, arms crossed. I thought about ignoring her for a split second, but she saw me before I could slide inside. "Jason!" she cried out, her voice exact and forceful. "We must chat," I mumbled. "What are you looking for, Rachel?" Her face twisted in wrath, and she rushed up the driveway. She spit, knowing you had been talking about me. Uploading items online, propaganda lies. I looked up one eyebrow. Lids? Specifically, care to be sure? She jabbed a finger in my direction and said, "You've been making me look like the evil person. Tell everyone I am selfish and self-centered, that I am not a good mother." I drew my arms over. "Rachel, I have no need of telling anybody anything. You are doing a fantastic job of showing your own worth." Her face flushed red, and for a few seconds I thought she might really knock me. "You don't know what it's like," she screamed. "Raising 4 kids, handling all this stress, you living here alone in this big house, acting like you're better than everyone else?" I didn't flinch. "Rachel and Danny tried to break into my house. When I was homeless, you teased me. You have done nothing except complicate every aspect of my existence. I will hence not feel sorry for you." She fixed me, her mouth opening and shutting like a fish trying to breathe. Then, without further word, she turned and bolted. She shakes my head as I watch her leave. She had obviously not come to atone or apologize. She simply wanted to let her wrath, that which in her eyes was totally my fault. The next couple of weeks were fascinating. Rachel's presence seemed to fan the drama boiling under the surface once more. She began sharing again on social media, evasive updates about how hard her life was and how some people didn't value family. Though the song and dance stayed the same, this time something changed. People were no longer leaning on her. Once on her side, the relatives were suddenly either silent or worse, publicly calling her off. "Maybe if you stopped blaming everyone else and took some responsibility," one cousin even said on one of her postings, "things would get better." Rachel erased the post after several hours, but damage was done. She hated it one bit since the tide was turning. Danny was breaking apart while Rachel was occupied portraying the victim. Word returned to me via a mutual relative fighting to keep things together after he had started binge drinking. Living with our parents plus Rachel's incessant moaning was too much for him. Not totally. I had no sympathy for him. Now Danny had to lie in his bed after making it. I couldn't overlook his brotherly relationship at the same time. And even with all he had done, part of me still yearned to think he was changeable. He dropped by my door one evening. He looked like hell, unshaven, his clothes ragged, and his eyes bloodshot. I briefly thought of slamming the door in his face, but something in his gaze stopped me. "Jason," he replied, his voice rough. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, and then moved aside. "You have 5 minutes." He slinked into the living room and sank on the couch like a man bearing world weight. We neither spoke for a moment. He broke the quiet then as well. Looking at the floor, he muttered, "I messed up. I knew I screwed up." I crossed my arms and leaned against the wall. And I'm sorry," he added, his voice almost above a whisper, "for all around, for attempting to seize your house, for my treatment of you during your growing years, for every last bit." I looked at him, trying to decide whether he was speaking honestly or merely what he felt I should hear. I had not heard before in his voice a fragility that made it difficult to question him. Finally, I said, "I'm not sure whether I could forgive you. Still, I value the apologizes. Tears filling his eyes, he nodded. I really just should have said it. Even if nothing changes as a result, I watched Danny not as the spoilt golden child, but rather as a broken guy trying to find his way for the first time in years. It was a beginning. It did not wipe the past. That evening, things started to gently alter. Danny started moving in the correct direction, even though he did not turn his life around overnight. He started seeking a better job, cut back on drinking, and even started going to therapy. Rachel, on the other hand, turned even more resentful and refused to accept any responsibility for her own behavior. Strangely, my parents also seemed to be trying too. Something they hadn't done in years, they began routinely attending church. They even apologized to me for the way they had treated me growing up. Though not perfect, far from it, it was improvement. For me, at last, I felt as though I could breathe. The house was peaceful, my work was consistent, and I was beginning to mend the relationships that counted while letting go of the ones that didn't. Though it was mine, it was not the life I had dreamed of for myself, and that was sufficient, for the first time in a very long time. Every step hesitant, unsure if the ice would hold or break beneath me, the months following Danny's apology felt like carefully strolling over a frozen lake. For all their shortcomings, my family was working to fix what they had damaged. I couldn't overlook that they were at least trying, even if their efforts were awkward and, at times, draining. But the harm of years does not go away with a few apologies and kind wishes. I spent much of my time concentrating on me. Work was consistent, my place was turning into more of a house, and I even began dating casually. Nothing major, just enough to jog me on what it feels like to interact with someone. Though it was not flawless, it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt as though I had influence over it. Rachel had not spoken to me since her outburst on my porch, but I knew she would not remain silent indefinitely. Yes, one clear fall morning I woke up to discover my truck egged. The side panels, the hood, and the windshield all bore the sticky muck splatters. It was young, petty, and quite definitely what Rachel would do. I went over the video coming from my new security cameras. Though the height and build were obvious, the offender had disguised their face. Rachel handled it. She had even changed into baggy clothing to hide herself, but it wouldn't take a detective to put it together. Not because I believed anything would result, but more to create a record. I reported a police incident. Should she have escalated, I preferred a documented trail. Though much of the damage was taken care of by a visit to the car wash, my truck wasn't fancy, and the idea stayed with me. Rachel was hungry, not only resentful, and in desperation, people act foolishly. Danny was gently reconstructing his life in the meantime. He had relocated into my camper, which we had placed up in the backyard of our parents. Though it wasn't perfect, it provided him space, and more significantly, it allowed his children room to breathe. He had given his oldest son his bedroom, a move that demonstrated he was striving to be a better father without wiping the past. Though not yet close, there was a tentative peace between us. He had stopped blaming me for his difficulties and, for the first time in years, appeared really intent on improving his own life. Therapy was helping, and so was the lack of Rachel's continuous control. He was still in financial straits, but he was not drowning now. Conversely, the children were doing quite well. Released from Rachel's poisonous influence, they had begun to share with me that I became the cool uncle, the one who allowed them to play board games in the camper when they visited, and raided my pantry for munchies. Though not much, it felt like a tiny portion of the family I had always desired but never had. Rachel's collapse arrived earlier than anyone could have predicted. Danny had secretly sought divorce, and the process had been terrible. Her treatment by the courts was not nice. Infidelity is very serious in our state, and Danny's proof, texts, emails, even DNA testing showing his youngest wasn't biologically his, painted a terrible picture. Rachel turned away with practically nothing. Limited custody of the children, no alimony, and a debt pile. Her parents brought her in, but even they appeared tired of her continual drama. Danny gained complete custody of the 3 biologically his children, and Rachel's visits were few and under pressure. Her youngest kid from her affair stayed with her, although her connection with the child's biological father was at best erratic. Word went fast across the family. Rachel's beautiful veneer had cracked as the golden couple fell apart. She withdrew into the shadows, stopping all social media posting. Life settled into something like normalcy when Rachel disappeared from the scene. Originally strong supporters of Rachel and Danny's decisions, my parents were quiet. Their pedestal had been lost in the family, and the relatives who had once looked up to them now recognized them for what they were: flawed, biased, and very human. To their credit, though, they were atonement-oriented. Now my mother was less critical, softer, and more engaged in the lives of her grandchildren. Though still cautious, my father looked really sorry for how he had treated me growing up. Though I wasn't ready to go that far, they had begun routinely attending church and even recommended family counseling. Danny also varied. Neither was he the entitled brat I had grown up with, nor the desperate, damaged guy who had tried to claim my house. He was only Danny, flawed, humble, and gradually finding his way. Though it turned out to be the wise choice, lending Danny the camper had been a risk. He had converted it into a small haven for himself where he might heal, gather, and grow. Treating it as a fort in their grandparents' backyard, the children liked it as well. Though it was only a beginning, Danny had not imagined this life for himself. And I looked at him, and for the first time in years I felt no resentment. Rather, I observed a man striving, actually, to be better. Regarding myself, at last I felt free, released from the weight of my family's expectations, from the bitterness that had eaten me for so long, and free to live my life on my own terms. Once a sign of strife, my house now was a refuge. Along with hosting friends and celebrating holidays, I also started organizing my first actual camping trip with the camper. Though it still was complex, my relationship with Danny and my parents was changing. Grand reconciliations and heartfelt apologies that would have magically healed past hurts were absent. There were little moments, too. Danny thanking me for the camper, my mother making cookies for my renters, and my dad fixing a faulty faucet. We were gradually coming to know a new normal. People like Rachel usually do. I know she will resurface sometime. Right now, though, she is absent from my life, and that is all that counts. My parents are learning, Danny's children are doing great, and I at last feel calm. Perfect is not what life is all about. Nothing will never be, but it's mine, and that is enough after all I have gone through.